Welcome to today's panel. What will AI mean for free expression? This is the first in a series of discussions that the Center for Free Expression is hosting on AI. I'm Jim Turk, the director of the center. Before introducing our panel, I'd like to acknowledge that the traditional territory on which I am speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations: the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I'd also like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed by multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsor for today's event, PEN Canada, and the McMaster University Master of Public Policy in Digital Society program. I'd like to introduce you to today's panel. The first is Seher Shafiq. Seher works for the Mozilla Foundation, where she runs a global program on ethical and trustworthy AI. Welcome, Seher. The second panelist is Summer Lopez. Summer is the Chief Program Officer, Free Expression for PEN America, and is co-author of PEN America's recent report, Speech in the Machine: Generative AI's Implications for Free Expression, a report that we're going to be talking about today and that I highly recommend you have a look at. It's online. Welcome, Summer.
Thank you, Jim.
And our third panelist is Salil Tripathi. Salil is an award-winning writer and journalist. He's on the board of PEN International and has been a senior visiting fellow at the Kennedy School at Harvard University. Welcome, Salil.
Thank you.
And Salil is speaking to us from Copenhagen today. Our moderator is Brenda McPhail. Brenda is the acting executive director of the Master in Public Policy and Digital Society program at McMaster University, and is on leave as director of Privacy, Technology, and Surveillance program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and one of Canada's leading experts on issues of secrecy and privacy and surveillance. Welcome, Brenda.
Thank you, Jim.
The format for today's event is that there's going to be a conversation amongst the panel for about 45 to 50 minutes, at which point Brenda is going to turn to you, the audience, to answer any questions that you might have. We're using a special version of the Zoom platform, so the chat isn't functional, but you'll notice at the bottom of your screen a little tab that says Q&A. So at any point as you're listening to the conversation with the panel, there's a question you'd like to ask or an issue you'd like to have explored more, please just click on that Q&A button and write out your question right then while you're thinking about it. And when Brenda turns to the audience after about 45, 50 minutes, she's going to ask Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator for the center, to read out the first question. The panel will answer it, and then she'll ask Ange to share the second question, and so on until we wrap up. So I think that's everything. Please do ask questions. We really want you to participate in the conversation. And now over to the panel.
Thank you, Jim. Welcome everyone in the audience to our inaugural session in a new series of talks co-sponsored by the Center for Free Expression and the program that I run, the Master of Public Policy and Digital Society program at McMaster University. As Jim said, my name is Brenda McPhail, and my current job is helping to educate policy leaders who are going to understand the ways that digital technologies are changing our world and the way that we need to craft policy in response to those changes. And this series of conversations, starting with today's panel, I think is a perfect opportunity to have publicly the kind of conversation that we need to be having to develop the right public policy to address these challenges in Canadian society, and of course, beyond. It's truly my pleasure and privilege to have been invited to moderate this series because this is a transformational technology. Artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence tools have the potential to change our world. And whether those transformations will be for good or for ill, or realistically somewhere in between, is a subject that's both hotly contested and profoundly unknown. We need to remember, however, as a society, as a people, that this is not the first time that we've been faced with a new technology that brings with it new risks and new potential. And one way to think through what might happen, and I think more importantly, what we want to happen with this technology as people in Canada, as global citizens, is to talk about it together, as a public, in public. So that's why we've convened this series of conversations. And over the next few months, we're going to talk about the ways in which different sectors, ranging from education to health to law to ethics, might be impacted by this rapidly evolving technology and by our government's seeming commitment to promoting it. We're going to talk about the ways in which it might put human rights at risk, or conversely, whether rights protections can be supported through technical tools. In other words, we're going to explore some of the wide-ranging policy questions that AI raises with people who are deeply knowledgeable and who are willing to share their expertise, like our panelist today. Before we turn to the panel, a little bit of ground setting. I'm assuming that everyone here knows what artificial intelligence is, and that's what drew you. But it is a technology that has a lot of hype and a bit of public mystique and dazzle around it. So I think it's important as a level setting exercise to say clearly, artificial intelligence isn't one single thing, one single tool or technology. It's a field of study. It's a name, a phrase that we sometimes carelessly apply to a range of technologies that are algorithmically driven. That's a hard word. For our purposes, think of algorithm as simply code, as instructions for a program or a process. So, not magic, just math telling a program or a tool what to do. AI encompasses concepts like machine learning, where programs are designed to learn without being explicitly programmed. Some programs might be designed to make predictions or decisions, and applications as diverse as reading a pattern of pixels in an X-ray, all the way to making consequential decisions about a human's suitability for a job or eligibility for insurance or a mortgage. Others, like the generative AI systems, you've likely heard a lot about since ChatGPT broke onto the public scene in November of 22, are trained on large quantities of data and use it to completely generate new outputs. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. In fact, the inspiration for today's conversation came from an examination of generative AI in a report, as Jim mentioned, by PEN America entitled Speech and the Machine, Generative AI's Implications for Free Expressions. And we really do have the privilege of, in our panel today, of having individuals who have all engaged deeply in issues of creativity and creative practice, censorship, information and disinformation, and our rights to expression, to speak, write, but also to hear and read information in order to engage in our world as informed citizens in the broadest sense of that word. So we're going to start today, as Jim mentioned, by having me ask them some questions to open up the conversation. And like Jim, I encourage you, if questions pop into your mind as we have this conversation, to put them into the Q&A tab as we go, and we will turn to those questions and look forward to answering them in due course. So Summer, Seher, and Salil, welcome.
Thank you.
Because Summer, your report served as our prompt for starting this series with this important and I think really under-considered topic of how AI impacts free expression, I'll begin with you. And I'm going to keep it very simple. What was behind PEN America producing this document? Why did you think this was the right topic at this moment to write about?
Yeah, thank you so much, Brenda. And it's a pleasure to be here and really honored to have the report kind of help inspire this conversation. I think that, like everybody else, we were struck by the release of ChatGPT last year and, thinking about the implications of that. And I think it became pretty clear to us pretty quickly that this was a new technology that was going to have real implications for writers, for our community as PEN, and for freedom of expression. And I think even in those, even now, I feel like the sort of human rights implications aren't getting as much attention as one might hope. And the free expression implications in particular, I think still aren't central enough to the conversation. So we really felt like it was important to come out and start talking about these issues early. We recognized we were not going to have all the answers. I always say that writing this report was like building the plane while flying it, because the news was coming out every day, new studies, new stories about what was happening with this technology. But we felt like it was important to put a bit of a marker down in terms of some of the free expression issues that we see as potentially concerning, as things that people need to be keeping their eyes on as the technology evolves and as our responses to it evolve. And also to be thinking about the implications for the creative sector. And I think that became quite central as we saw these issues at the heart of a lot of what was under conversation in the writer's strike in Hollywood as well. So, I think that kind of made it real for a lot of people in ways that it might not have been otherwise, but that, was also very much a concern for us. And we didn't want it to be, apocalyptic. Again, these are tools for creativity as well, and things that I think some writers want to make use of in meaningful ways. They can increase accessibility, they can do all sorts of things. But we also, know that as new technologies like this emerge, we want to make sure that free expression is part of the conversation. We also know that sometimes the response to things like disinformation, for example, certain responses can also infringe on freedom of expression, right? So we want to make sure that this is being thought about as regulatory frameworks or other conversations get started. So we really saw it as kind of an initial foray into the conversation, but an important one to make at this stage.
Couldn't agree more. I tend to do a lot of my work centering around privacy rights. And I think privacy is one of the topics that comes up. And you're absolutely right that there are other equally important rights that aren't getting highlighted in the same way, and expression is absolutely one of them. Salil, Summer shared the motivating factors behind PEN America's writing of their report. As a journalist and as a board member of PEN International, can you tell us a little bit about your experience, what you're seeing or hearing internationally in terms of issues rising from the use of generative AI tools in the creative sphere?
Yeah, sure. There are, Summer is absolutely right in pointing out that, there are positive and creative ways in which AI can be used. And I was just last week in London and talking to a crime fiction writer, and he said it's very good at prompting ideas of plot twists. Now, you can get that at a pub in London where you're meeting and talking with friends and writers, and they tell you, and this is very harmless. You want to write and find out what could be the motive of a murder that he wants to write about. And also, those kinds of things are very positive and generative in the nice sense of the term. But we also know that this can be weaponized. And the word that Summer used, which I think is very crucial here, is disinformation, because there's a distinction between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is easy. It means you make a mistake, not out of an intent, but it becomes part of the common folklore because you have said something that is not true. And that becomes common parlance, everybody uses it. And thanks to the speed with which the whole dissemination takes place, there's that old Jonathan Swift quote, which I always turn to, which is that falsehood flies and truth comes limping after it. And, we have also learned it from the other person. Jonathan Swift was, of course, writing it in the 16th or 17th century. But I think there's a logic to that, because it's what we talk about as that, lie is already 100 miles away when the truth is still trying to tie its shoelaces. So that's misinformation, which is wrong, but it's not malintended. Problem is, of course, disinformation. And I think we will spend time more. So I don't want to go too much into it, but that's deliberate, motivated spread of fake news to create a viral impact, which can have devastating consequences. At one level, and having seen what happens in places like Myanmar and elsewhere, I want to say that the easiest impact, the easiest outcome of that is actually an election manipulation, because that still means people aren't dead. But when you look at what happened in Kenya in the 2010s and so on, and elsewhere in the world, there are actually massacres that take place because of disinformation. Who creates it? What is the motivation? It's almost impossible because there are no fingerprints to chase after. So there is a genuine concern about how the technology is going to be deployed, who is in charge of it, who is regulating it, and nothing is known about it. And right now, the real worry that I have, frankly, and I think Seher, you might want to say more about it also, is that the state is literally abdicating its responsibility to regulate it. It wants Microsoft and Google and companies and Facebook and Meta, companies like that, to come up with a framework for regulating them, which basically means that people, I mean, it's like, asking the poacher to turn into a gamekeeper in a way. And, you are trying to get somebody who's benefiting from the system to create the rules by which it is supposed to work. And they may be very nice individuals and they may want to get it right, but with the fragmentation of international order, with BRICS countries becoming more important, the multiplicity of jurisdictions that come in, there are extremely serious questions of generative AI, what it will do to what we remember, what our stories are, what our history is, where the archives are, who owns them, and what will be remembered in future. So I'm more on the pessimistic or cautious side rather than the optimistic. I'd love to read more innovative Sherlock Holmes stories written by other people, but at the same time, I don't want a devastating massacre.
I'm a big mystery fan myself. I'm a little concerned about the idea of AI creating twists that I couldn't predict. It's a point of pride. I usually know who done it by about halfway through the book. But it's also, I think you raise a really important point, and I'm glad that you did it at this outset of the conversation, that even in the creative sector, where with the writer's strike in the news, we hear sort of doom and gloom around artificial intelligence, there are voices who say, this is useful to me. This can form a new and exciting part of my creative practice. If I have, to the extent that a creative author or actor has autonomy in deciding where and how to use that and maintains control over their creativity and their process. Ideally, also getting paid for it.
Yeah.
So that sort of two-sided impacts on the creative sector, I think, is something that I'm really glad that you brought forward, and I will possibly come back to those sort of two sides of the coin as we keep going through the conversation. But for now, I want to bring Seher into the conversation. And it's opportune that Salil mentioned Kenya, because you, of course, have just come from the huge Mozilla festival that you helped organize in Kenya, with thousands of participants, I understand, from more than 145 countries, all people concerned about ensuring the internet benefits humanity, and who are focused in this session on building more trustworthy AI. So could you share some of the key observations that emerged from that convening, or the concerns that were expressed?
Yes, absolutely. I think before I go into that, I should explain a little more in detail about Mozilla and what we do in the trustworthy AI space, because most people know about Mozilla from Firefox, and we're so much more than that. So Mozilla started in the 90s, kind of as a movement against Microsoft, which at the time was engaging in behavior that would have caused a monopoly over browsers. And so the Mozilla project was started, we open sourced the code, Netscape Navigator was created, eventually that moved into AOL, and then Firefox was developed. And so the roots of Mozilla are actually a nonprofit. So Mozilla was started as a project within another organization and then incorporated as a nonprofit. And then a corporation was created, and now we have a bunch of products. What that means is that Mozilla is still very much an advocacy organization. And since 2019, we have had a strategic focus of trustworthy AI. So this is years before ChatGPT came out, just under a year ago. We were already thinking about what it means for an AI industry that has AI products on the market that benefit human well-being. And that's actually the language that we use in our theory of change as well. So that's some of the context. I am on the foundation team, and I helped to organize Mozilla's largest public-facing event, which is Mozilla Festival. We did recently have one in Kenya just about a week ago. That was a smaller one. It was about 300 people, largely across Africa and some from other parts of the world as well. And there's so much. I think all of the things that both panelists have mentioned so far, there's that and more. In Kenya specifically, there was a lot of discussion around content moderation. There's a lot of discussion around how AI replicates bias and can be exploitative, specifically as it relates to content moderation, but also OpenAI and data labeling and all sorts of jobs that are traumatic, very underpaid, and are kind of being offloaded onto largely African countries. So there's a whole conversation that we had over there about how what's happening with AI is, in a sense, recolonization. And then, of course, lots of conversations around the creative industries. So much. I'm just looking at my notes here. A lot of human rights implications as well. That's super high level. I could go into detail into a lot of those, but there's a lot there.
There is a lot there. We've raised a lot of issues in our initial round of questions. So maybe for the next couple of rounds, we'll narrow our focus on just a few of them that I think are particularly important. We've already brought out the idea that for the creative sector, there are two sides that these tools can be used to support creativity and also to undermine or threaten the creative process. But what I'd like to ask you, Seher, to do, if you don't mind, is talk us through those two sides, specifically with attention to the way that free expression is engaged when these tools are used to either, support or diminish creative expression.
Yeah, I mean, I think we also thought about it in terms of when we're thinking about the implications for writers in the creative sphere in particular, there's sort of both the practical and the philosophical elements, right? I mean, there's sort of the bigger picture questions of what it means if, for sort of the value of the written word, for how we think about human creativity and ingenuity and the value of literature. And I think, PEN as an institution, the entire network is really established on the idea that literature is fundamentally important for humanity, that it breaks down barriers, that it, can reach across difference and foster understanding and empathy and, bring to life all of the nuances and complexities of the human experience. And so I think if you are thinking about increasingly taking the humans out of that process, I think there are real implications about that are kind of at more of a philosophical level, and again, without sort of foreclosing the potential of this as a tool for creativity and expression and access to information. And then there's the more practical concerns around sort of ownership, livelihood, the replacement of writers in various industries. And how their work is being used to train generative AI tools, right? And obviously, we've also seen lawsuits from authors against some of the AI companies, and this was all central to the writer's strike too. And I think, although I think in the context of the writer's strike, it's also interesting that again they weren't sort of asking for prohibitions on the use of AI altogether, asking for sort of guidelines around it that ensure that it wouldn't it wouldn't supplant the role of writers and the opportunity for writers to be credited and compensated appropriately for their work. And so I think, and I think the outcome of that seems like they basically kind of got what they asked for, which I think is quite important as a precedent-setting element for writers in other industries as well. Victory for the strike itself, but I think with real significant and important implications. And so, I think that again, from a free expression perspective, this is about maintaining the potential for these as important tools, but also ensuring that we're not sort of devaluing human voice, human writing, and the sort of unique creative spark that is built on. And I think there are hopefully ways to do that. And then I'm also happy to talk about sort of the other piece of the report for us was really how we see this as potentially kind of supercharging some of the existing threats to free expression that we're worried about, disinformation and other things, among them bias and all of that. So I'm happy to go into that more too.
Yeah. As you were speaking about the philosophical concerns, it popped into my head, can a machine tell a human story? And immediately I caught myself, because of course the answer to that is no, because the machine is not telling the story. Generative AI works on a large language model where it essentially sucks in a whole bunch of data and uses that to predict what words should go together in a string. So I think it's a useful useful to question those sort of profound philosophical issues, and it's also useful to ground that questioning in the current realities of the technology, because part of the mystique of artificial intelligence is that word intelligence, which, is it smart? What's it doing? What's it telling us? What's it saying? What's it thinking? Well, it's not telling us or saying or thinking things in the human sense of those words. And that's, part of the larger conversation about what it means to engage these tools in a creative process. Salil, Summer has referenced it. You mentioned it in your opening comments. Summer even used the phrase, and it's the same one that comes to my mind when I think about the potential impact of generative AI on free expression, is that potential to supercharge disinformation. The issue of misinformation and disinformation online and the polarizing effects that it's having on society is not a problem that comes from generative AI, or even from AI itself, although AI tools are known to amplify the problem. But those tools, absolutely have the potential to make it worse. So we know that programs like ChatGPT, for example, are prone to occasionally hallucinate, which is a nice way of saying they just flat out make things up. We've probably all heard the story of the lawyer in the US who had the AI write a legal submission, and it did so beautifully, except for the fact it completely made up some of the cases on which it based the key arguments. So when we spoke before the panel, I had an opportunity to meet with the panelists before today. And when we spoke, Salil, you said something that I've been thinking about ever since. You said, in the age of generative AI, who owns history? So can you talk a bit about that and why it matters in the context of AI and expression?
Yeah, I think who owns history is extremely crucial, because conflicts of today and tomorrow are based on selective interpretation of what happened in the past, right? I mean, you have somebody, take actual conflict, like, when Slobodan Milosevic was speaking at in the former Yugoslavia, and he told the Serbian people that no one will ever humiliate you or hurt you, which was a coded way of reminding people about what happened in 1389. Which is, when the transfer of power occurred, and it was extremely brutal and violent, and the Serb people felt that their superiority was being taken away from them by other people, and the Ottoman power rises and so on. And this is not unique just to former Yugoslavia. I don't want to pick on just that one story, but people want to go back to, there was a phrase that 2 American academics had written once about ancient hatreds. And those ancient hatreds keep getting repeated. The problem, though, is this, that, when you have mythologies being created, which people have handed down generation to generation, which were never told before, but are now getting widespread dissemination because of the speed and the spread of dissemination. And the speed and spread, Seher, you were talking about Nairobi, but when we look at the Kenyan elections of 2008 and then 12, the lies were being told and spread through SMS messages. And therefore, Safaricom, which was a company which was operating in Kenya at that time, actually came up with a code of conduct about what will and what will not be allowed to be spoken. But the bad guys are a step ahead. They moved on to Facebook, then they moved to Twitter. They always know the next thing that they should attract. And what's happened is that now that mechanism of manufacturing a past, in the past, in the Soviet Union, you airbrushed people from photographs, right? You suddenly found that a photograph of Stalin will no longer have Khrushchev in the picture or something like that. And you suddenly realize that something had changed and you had no idea that why did someone disappear. I've seen that as a journalist in Malaysia, where Mahathir Mohamad and Anwar Ibrahim were at that time partners, and they split apart. Mahathir was the prime minister, and suddenly Anwar's face disappeared. So that kind of erasure of history goes on. And the other thing is creation of new heroes. I was born in India, and now you have new heroes of the Indian independence movement who had nothing to fight for independence, who are being built up as though they were as important as Gandhi was, for example. So you have this assault happening. What makes it difficult with generative AI is that it makes it look very credible. It makes it look as if it's believable. It's said in a way that sounds tempting. It can create videos that are credible looking with sepia tinted prints and so on. Deep fakes and all that will proliferate. And if the archives that exist are no longer under control, I mean, we know that again, going back to the Yugoslav conflict, one of the first things to be attacked were the libraries, right? In the Ukrainian conflict, the first thing that is being attacked these days are the Ukrainian libraries. You destroy the collective known knowledge and living memory of a community and a group. And then you create this new thing and claim that this is real, that can have devastating consequences for future conflicts. So that's the part that I'm not saying it's what keeps me awake. I mean, that's a nice way to put it, but that's the thing that worries me hugely.
Yes, and when we think about sort of, the stories that you see about deepfakes are, the Pope in a puffer coat.
Yeah.
But the actual implications when it comes to changing the words or the presence.
There is a video going around. I don't know if you've seen it. Summer, you may have seen it because it's an American video of Joe Biden. It's his voice, it's his face, the lip sync is perfect. And he says things that are extremely homophobic. And I've seen that video shown, and I've seen anti-gay rights activists, the homophobes themselves, saying, actually, he's our guy in the White House, so we should not oppose him too much. And it's profoundly worrisome. I just don't know how you can fight it by saying that, no, he did not really say that, because it's a fiction. It's a work of fiction, but at the same time, it's incredibly credible.
And in the increasingly polarized environment politically that we all find ourselves in, that undermining of a core concept of truth is deeply, deeply problematic.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just add to that quickly, I mean, I think part of the thing that concerns me too is, I think people will also just start to feel like they already feel this to some extent, but that you really just can't trust any information, right? I mean, if it really becomes so difficult to discern between what's real and what's false, and that's always been kind of our approach to disinformation, is really to help the public be better educated and better able to make that distinction, because sort of, regulatory and legislative solutions to it will themselves infringe on free expression in most cases. But that solution doesn't work very well when the disinformation is so convincing. And so, I really worry that people essentially just disengage altogether, right? That you just foster greater apathy, greater disengagement, greater disenfranchisement from civic life and the political process, because people just really don't know what to trust anymore.
And believe that black is white. The pizza story and Hillary Clinton, there are lots of Americans who believe that there is a pedophile pizza parlor somewhere in Virginia or wherever it was. Yeah. And I think that's the dangerous part, that this erosion of trust and credibility in the mainstream media is, and therefore, in the Soviet Union and China, people used to say that when you can't believe the printed word, you believe the spoken word. Now, that's fine if you're dealing with Pravda and Izvestia, but it is not so when you're dealing with mainstream publication. But now the mainstream publications are being presented as though they are the purveyors of lies and falsehood, and this newfangled avatars, who claim to be AI-generated news anchors will probably start writing the truth. So it's quite disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to shift the order here a little bit because we're on a roll. I think, Seher, you wrote in your report about the ways that, although responsible and ethical journalism is sometimes cited as a defense against misinformation, it's possible that these tools can help contribute to a continued erosion in the public trust of journalists. And you've written about the ways that, you've written about some of the challenges that this raises specifically in the context of journalism. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more, carrying on this line of thinking about what the challenges and the impact on expression are for the ways that AI is undermining trust in mainstream journalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few factors. Again, I mean, one kind of goes back to sort of the livelihood question, and we have PEN America has also done research on sort of the collapse of local journalism in the U.S. and the implications of that for civic life and democracy. And there is also the potential that more jobs in the journalism industry could be replaced with AI tools in different ways, and that could sort of further erode the industry and make it even more challenging for journalists than it already is. So there's that kind of concern. And then there is, this sort of, when we first put out our first report on disinformation back in 2017, we called it fraudulent news at the time, because we were kind of saying part of what we were concerned about was information that was masquerading as real journalism, but wasn't. We kind of stopped using that framing because so much of the disinformation was actually happening not in that context, just, again, on Facebook, in chat groups, et cetera. But now I think we're a little bit back to that concern, actually. One of the things we talk about in the report is, a reporter who basically generated an entire fake news website in about half an hour using a generative AI tool. And, the fact that it was extremely convincing. Again, we have done media literacy work over the years. We tell people to look for things like, does it have an editorial policy? Is there information about the funders? Look for the bios of the reporters. Like, these are some of the, indicators that a source is real and trustworthy. Because a lot of the sort of, pink slime news sites out there just don't bother with that kind of stuff. But now you can actually generate all of that very quickly. And so again, it just becomes much harder for the public to sort of differentiate. And for a lot of the efforts that people are putting into countering disinformation suddenly become a lot less effective if sort of those tactics and tools that we've been trying to equip people with just become a lot less useful. And it just becomes cheaper and easier to generate this stuff, without actually having to put a whole lot of effort into it. And again, having it be really convincing in a way that can just be very confusing for people. Again, I think it is often just about people feeling overwhelmed by information, about not knowing what to trust and sort of disengaging, versus really necessarily believing the disinformation. That is one danger, but I think the sort of apathy and disengagement is a kind of underappreciated danger as well.
I want to add the angle here of social media platforms, because there's one piece of creating this content and, it appears real, it's very convincing. But then there's this other part where social media companies and platforms are actively, intentionally pushing this stuff forward, because the algorithm, whatever gets the most clicks, the algorithm automatically pushes more of that. And social media companies know this, and yet they still intentionally decide not to, because fighting against that type of behavior would impact their bottom line. And so then, so there's an aspect here about platform regulation and we call them platform recommender systems. Mozilla's done a bunch of work and research on this as well. And actually, we did one study called YouTube Regrets, where people donated their YouTube data to Mozilla, and we analyzed it, and we determined that YouTube was actively pushing harmful content onto people just for clicks. And as a result of our report, YouTube actually changed their behavior. So there's an aspect here of holding these companies to account and really putting the onus, like, yes, it is easy to get fooled by these things. You look at a pope in a puffer jacket and it looks really real, but I want to make sure that we're not putting the onus on people, and that it really goes towards the companies and also regulators as well, because that is how all of this is proliferating. Including with journal articles. Some of what we were both talking about reminds me of just recently. I was so shocked. We had a Toronto mayoral election, and in a Toronto mayoral election, one of the candidates used deepfakes and AI and created this false imagery, and just like, I just couldn't believe it, how real it was that this is happening here in my own very city. So yeah, the speed at which all of this is happening is so fast, and government isn't really equipped to move as quickly as the technology is developing, and we're just at this very pivotal moment. It's scary.
Well, and you're right to point out, I tend to also, in some of the advocacy work that I do, talk about the need for individual resilience, for media literacy education, for the need to, and of course as an educator now, to make sure that students understand what is a good source, what is a questionable source, how do you interrogate them. But you're absolutely right, Seher, that the onus cannot be solely on individuals to make those kind of calls when they exist within an information ecosystem that is in some ways trying to thwart their ability to do so by feeding them content that, some system somewhere thinks they're going to like, that's going to be sticky, that's going to keep their attention. The other sort of interesting regulatory approach that also is deeply problematic and that has already come up a little bit is around the question of content moderation. I mean, here in Canada, of course, we've been having really difficult conversations for quite a while now about how we manage the difficult balance between online harms up to and including hate speech online with free expression. And one of the solutions that perennially comes up is content moderation. And there are a lot of issues with that. But rather than me listing them, I'm going to toss it out to the panel. What do you think are the benefits and risks of content moderation as it is currently practiced? And where are let's just leave it there. What are the benefits and risks of content moderation, and what would you raise to be the real core challenges about relying on content moderation in an online context that cares about expression? Seher, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll start. I think I might use this as a platform to share what I learned about content moderation, specifically in Africa, just recently at MozFest. So our keynote speaker was Daniel Motung, which if you follow the content moderation and platform accountability space, he's a human rights defender, whistleblower. Essentially, his story is he comes from a very, very poor background. One day he was browsing a newspaper and he saw a job that was for I don't even know if content moderation were the words that were used, but whatever the advertisement was, the impression that he got was that he'll be working with newspapers and looking at content in newspapers. He was poor, desperate, and so he decided to take this job. Only after he received a little bit of training did he learn that he was working for a social media company. And only after that did he realize that his job would entail endless hours, being paid $2.20 an hour, endless hours of viewing gruesome images, like the most disgusting things that human beings are capable of that they then put on Facebook. And his job was to view all of that and then sort it and label it. And that was content moderation. He then developed PTSD as a result, but didn't realize it for, I think, years because he didn't have the language to understand what was going on until a news reporter kind of identified some of the signs. And then he realized what had happened to him, and eventually in all of this he got fired from that job as well. And so now his life mission is to share information about how content moderation is being outsourced to largely countries in Africa, very much in Kenya. OpenAI is doing a very similar thing. They call it data labeling because technically it's not content moderation. It's not a social media platform, but essentially the same thing, looking at images and information and labeling it. And they're employing Kenyan workers at about $2 an hour as well. So there's a lot there. Content moderation obviously is really, really helpful, but at the same time, there's something to be said about these big tech companies that are, dictating the terms of how we even live in society. They're so pervasive in everyday life, and all of this invisible labor that's happening behind the scenes that is highly exploitative. It's really recreating and reinforcing power structures globally. And it's also coming at the expense of what we call the global majority, which is essentially not North America and not European countries, but they are the global majority. And so there's this weird tension, this weird dynamic that's just being replicated through content moderation. Some people are calling sweatshops. And yeah. It's quite wild. I'd love to hear others' thoughts on that.
I mean, I think you touch on such an important aspect of this that gets far too little attention, first of all. And I think, for us, and I mean, from the US perspective, of course, I think we are also seeing sort of political battles around this right now, right? We're seeing legal cases, debates about what authority the platforms really have to moderate content at all. Are they doing it in a politicized way? I think, I'll just speak about sort of a little piece of it. I think it's important that the platforms be able to moderate content, like fundamentally, right? I think like if you look at Twitter right now, we're seeing what happens when that kind of goes away and it becomes just like a wasteland of, terrible content and bots and, all of the things that drive people off the platform to begin with. And we do a lot of work on online abuse and its impact on writers and journalists, and we see it as a free expression issue because it silences people, right? It makes people not want to engage online. It drives them off the platforms. It makes people think twice about what they say in a public space. And so, we do believe that it's important for the platforms to set their standards and to hold their users to them. At the same time, we also recognize that these are spaces that are very much the public square to some extent, and we want there to be space for a wide range of views and debate, and even content that people may find offensive or unpleasant. We're not generally, as a free expression organization, advocating for a lot more content to be taken down. We're trying to think about what are the ways that you give users more autonomy over sort of their experience on a platform, how to better protect themselves, how to sort of control what's in their feed and things like that. And so I think there's such a fine kind of balance to be struck here. And I think what Seher's talking about makes me think too. Part of the challenge, I think, is that often the sort of machine-based content moderation isn't very nuanced, right? We see all the time that it can kind of sweep up a whole bunch of content that doesn't really have any basis to be taken down, that it, reproduces the biases of the humans who programmed it to begin with, that it tends to be much more likely to take down the content of Black Lives Matter than the Proud Boys. We've seen that time and again. And yet the human content moderation has this very real human cost to it that isn't really being talked about and addressed. And so I don't have any sort of solution to that, but I think that's a really kind of fundamental question to think about. And then we are going to see these things sort of replicated in the context of the AI companies. And I think overall a sort of theme for me is that there's a lot of things we haven't addressed in the context of social media that are just going to come back up again in a different way in the context of AI, of generative AI. And, we haven't kind of bothered to resolve or address them sufficiently to begin with. And so we need to try to learn some lessons, but we're unfortunately not in a very good place in terms of, success stories from how we've addressed some of these challenges with social media.
Yeah, the question I have is at a corollary and, at an angle to what both of you have expressed. And I completely agree that, we make the mistaken assumption of treating social media as public space, whereas they're private spheres. They have the look and illusion of a public space, but they're owned by individuals or companies who are answerable to the owners or the shareholders. So, and we confuse that, and therefore then we expect them. And, if in my home somebody comes and starts behaving badly, I have the right to kick that person out. Or not kick that out physically, but at least to take the person out of my room. And I think by the same logic, social media platforms try to exercise that. The problem is that the value systems that underpin those decisions vary. And they vary across culture and even within, and there's no consistency being applied. So on one hand, I completely, what you were talking about, Seher, about this person who was constantly watching, Kenyan person who was constantly watching grotesque imagery. Several years ago, at one of the first Access Now meetings in San Francisco, I remember Victoria Grant, who was at that time the YouTube chief legal officer or something, she said exactly the same, that I'm worried about the PTSD kind of syndromes of these people who are constantly watching what we all would call grotesque pornography. And because they were trying to label it. But what is being applied and what are the rules being labeled and who is doing the... So is it the libertarian Northern Californian notion that should prevail? Because, as soon as you travel from US to Europe, Europe has the right to be forgotten. Europe has Article 8 and Article 10 of the European Charter of Human Rights, one of which guarantees free speech, the other of which guarantees privacy. And that privacy right can actually allow a politician to hide his or her past. So when you try to do a Google search for some politician's corruption or something like that. I mean, Google will tell you that in European Union, we cannot tell you that information because of the private. So the whole notion of who the public person and what the history is simply hidden from you. And the same thing applies, that if you try to apply those notions of free for all free speech, which Elon Musk claims he believes in, and if you genuinely were to apply it in South Asia or Southeast Asia, you'll have more and more massacres. Now, for whatever reason, Musk has now withdrawn from that. Every time India says, remove this, and even if it's a harmless tweet, Musk takes it out. And, he's being incredibly compliant. So when we're talking about machine-based decision-making versus human supervision, it depends on who's doing it. Just a couple of days ago, Washington Post had this amazing series of articles about Meta and India, and how weaponization of pro-government, pro-BJP material keeps coming out day after day. And Facebook or Meta were doing nothing about it and were letting it prevail. So yes, on one hand, it would be good to have human supervision. The real question is, what are the values that underpin those decisions? And that's where I come down to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, commonly understood standing and understanding on what free expression is, and restrictions only when there is an imminent danger of incipient violence that is being incited by somebody. It's easy for all of us to agree on that. Trying to implement it is extremely hard. I'm aware of that.
Well, and you've raised a couple of really important nuances to the conversation when we're talking about global platforms, which is that we're talking about free expression and artificial intelligence, our core concept of what free expression means differs from country to country, even between the US and Canada, which share the largest undefended border in the world. The First Amendment has a different understanding and provides different protections for free expression than our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And then, as you mentioned, the European Union has another understanding and another set of instruments that do the job, again, in a different way. So not only are we talking, when we talk about content moderation, about a complex problem that has both profound human costs, and where when you try to scale using technology to avoid those costs, you lose so much in nuance and understanding. But the overarching issue is we don't actually have a global consensus on what is expression that requires protection. Which I think brings us to a question that weighs on me a lot, which is, we've talked about platforms' roles in content moderation. We've talked a little bit about individuals and education and what people can do. What is the state role, do you think? To what degree should states become involved in regulating expressive content online? What are the risks of that? What are the challenges? What do you think about state engagement? And this is a pressing question in Canada, where for the last several years, we've been flirting with a bill that's meant to address, and it's been characterized as online harms legislation. And we've engaged in a massive coast to coast public consultation, trying to get the sense of what the public thinks about concepts of online harms. So from your different perspectives in different places in the world, what is the state's role in regulating this?
I'll take a stab at it, and I'll probably change my mind by the time I hear from Seher and Summer. But I genuinely believe that we have to start with the basic premise, and the basic premise is that international human rights law applies to states first, because it's the states which are obligated under international treaties to comply with them. And the reason we are relying or expecting to rely on social media platforms to do the content moderation is because the state is failing. I mean, if the state did its job, then in an unbiased manner, we would not be having this conversation. But the state is failing in playing its role. But there's a good reason to be very, very deeply skeptical of the state, because the state is also the biggest denier of freedom. I mean, I was born in India. India is the #1 country which keeps taking stuff off the internet, asking for internet shutdown. It's a terrible, terrible record. And I never call India the world's largest democracy. I call it the world's most populous country that regularly holds elections. So when you accept that premise and the way it operates, it's a very, very different kind of a context. that, the state is not your guarantor of freedom. So the only, I'm not saying it is a solution because it's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. But the only way it can happen is for a good multi-stakeholder approach where you have some companies, some civil society members, some bureaucrats and not elected officials, because bureaucrats don't have to stand for elections. And what's critically, academics and lawyers who are going to err on the side of freedom to create some kind of a consortium. Film certification works that way, right? It's quasi-state body, but it's a bunch of individuals who decide what should and should not be seen. And I think something similar is needed, because the key difference is this, that if I don't like something on internet, I don't have to seek its ban. I just have to get off that channel and not watch it. I'm not being forced to watch it. It's like books. Books are published. You don't have to burn them. You don't read them. You don't buy them. You tell other people that's a terrible book, or you write a better book and argue against it. These are the ways forward in dealing with book censorship. And I think we have to try to adopt that mindset and see how that can be applied in the context of what happened. Because all that the internet and social media platform do is they're doing it much faster on a wider scale and very, very swiftly and spread very fast, unlike a book, for example.
So Salil, you said you might change your mind by the end of our answers, but you've already changed my mind. Your answer. My immediate reaction was, the question was, what is their role? And my immediate reaction was large role. Like, we need regulation, we need the state to intervene and keep the companies in check. But then, Salil, you made me realize that that's a very North American approach, because I'm taking for granted the fact that my state protects me and that they can guarantee freedoms. I was literally just a week ago at this, so all of this is top of mind, but we had a session about the Sudanese war, and we had 2 women actually travel from Sudan and Uganda. They had been displaced 6 months ago due to the war. Atrocious stories all around. And one of the things that they talked about was the role of the state and how the government had basically kept so many people completely in the dark, like literally no internet. Anyone who's in Darfur, totally dark. We have absolutely no idea whatsoever what is happening there, because they're totally cut off. They're sharing information through WhatsApp when they have internet access, and when not, sometimes things like when you send a bank transfer and there's a little box that says message for the recipient, they're sharing updates on what's happening in the war through that. And so they talked about how sometimes even through these tactics, when they share information of what's happening in the war and they're trying to fight back, the state ends up saying, oh, these are just AI rumors. This isn't real. It's fake news. It's AI. And so, yeah, anyway, Salil, like what you're saying really made me realize that it's so there's no one answer, and to say that, these companies have to be regulated by the state is a very North American approach. So thank you for that.
I would say it might be even just a more Canadian approach, because I would not necessarily want our government doing that either. We're in the middle of fighting book bans and legislative gag orders on what can be taught in K through 12 and higher education classrooms. And, I think, again, I come with a First Amendment sort of mindset in the US. And, I think the role for the state has to be quite limited. But I do think, one of the things we call for in the report is that, again, in the US, we have still failed to pass any sort of comprehensive privacy legislation. We haven't passed, we have a Platform Accountability and Transparency Act that's kind of about very basic transparency requirements. These are pretty baseline things that we have not yet done. And I think, that's kind of the first thing that we say should happen, because that would really provide some basis for anything further. And it's really just kind of fundamental at this point. I think in terms of, we see all sorts of legislation introduced about content regulation that is, well-intended in many cases, right? Right now we're having a fight over legislation that is intended to protect children online. But the actual implications of it would be terrible from a free expression perspective, and would actually, in fact, particularly harm LGBTQ communities online, and all sorts of things that, are actually, the same people would want all of these things to be addressed, but they actually can't be addressed without some sacrifices. So, I think that there's part of what we say in the report is really, that as much as legislation and regulation already moves very slowly compared to technology, what we don't want is sort of a knee-jerk attempt to regulate new technologies in ways that are going to have unforeseen consequences, implications for free expression, and that haven't been really thought through in terms of the impacts for all of the communities who might be affected. And again, recognizing that when regulation is set in the US, it's going to have global implications as well. And so we see authoritarian countries all the time, obviously passing laws to restrict things like disinformation. And of course, one could say that sounds like a good idea, but who are those laws being used against? Journalists, writers, dissidents, activists. And so, we definitely, that's not the solution, that we want to see. I think that, obviously that does make it really challenging. And I think, we've seen already policymakers come out with a bunch of different frameworks and guidelines and blueprints and all these various different terms for things. I think that actually is important. And, there's a White House blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. I think that's an important step. I think there's a lot of effort in Congress right now to consult, to have conversations and get input from different stakeholders. I think that's important. I think we really want to make sure that whatever process kind of moves forward on this, that it's informed by civil society, by human rights activists, by the communities who will be most affected, and that it's really considering, the potential implications and what some of those, unforeseen consequences might be.
That feels like a beautiful summary moment that gives us a really great opportunity to segue to questions from our audience. And do we have any questions that people would like to raise?
Yeah, I do want to remind attendees that they can use the Q&A button at the bottom of their screen to ask questions at this point. The first question is from an attendee. They say the panel has talked about how AI is making it possible to undermine all the tools for media literacy that we have taught as a way to expose disinformation. If this is true, what options do you recommend as alternatives?
Summer, do you want to start with that one? I feel like that's a little bit.
I mean, I think we're still kind of figuring it out, honestly. I think not all of the disinformation out there is going to suddenly be at this very high quality, right? I think some things are still going to be, some of these images that we've talked about, the Pope and the puffer jacket and all of that, they still had some telltale signs that they weren't actually real images. So, I think there are some tools that are still relevant for people, definitely. Like, we still want people to just be critical thinkers about the content that they're looking at and really question where it came from. Do they really trust that source, et cetera? I think the bar just has to be higher, basically. But I do think that thinking about what this might look like in different contexts, how we can make sure that people and institutions who are trusted sources of information are sort of equipped with the information that they can share with others, and with helping people think about how generative AI is going to affect the information landscape, I think is really important. I mean, again, I just feel like we're already behind the 8 ball. We have our entire way of consuming and receiving information as a human race has completely changed in the last 30 years, and we really haven't address that, right? We're not addressing this kind of in our educational system, in a really comprehensive way that kind of prepares people for what the information landscape looks like out there. So I don't think we should give up on that by any means. I think education really is still a critical piece of it, and continuing to help people understand what these new tools are, how they could be used, how people can, understand how they might be utilized and how they might be weaponized. I still think that that's a vital piece of the approach. We just have to kind of now think about this new set of technology and tools that are part of the challenge.
I also think there's an interesting question about whether or not these technologies can help us solve the problems that they create. So Canada recently announced a voluntary code of conduct for AI companies. I'm deeply critical of it. That's for a different panel. But one of the provisions in that code actually speaks to this concern, because there's a provision requiring content that's generated by AI to be marked in some way as generated by artificial intelligence. And to some degree, that if it were well done, and that's a gigantic if, and if it were meaningfully done, and there's another gigantic if, it would be helpful to go onto a site and find something, that site that you were describing, set up in half an hour that looked like a real media site. It would be helpful if there was a law that said that site was required to display somewhere prominently, not buried like a privacy policy, that the site was manufactured by artificial intelligence. So I think there are interesting ways to think about how the tool itself can be used to combat risks in the tool. And that's
and I think that kind of labeling is a way forward, at least as a stopgap measure, because Ian Fleming died in the 1960s or 70s. I don't know when he died. And you're a crime fiction fan, so you might relate to this. But James Bond, there were about 25 novels and short stories, but now there are about 40 or 45 available. But it clearly says Ian Fleming's James Bond as written by, and then it tells you who the ghostwriter is or the new writer is. So I think so, and that's labeling. And I think if publishers and large distributors like Amazon and others were to very clearly state that, yes, this is a novel, it is a romantic novel, it looks like Mills and Boon, but it's not Mills and Boon, it's written by a machine. And then if the marketplace wants it, if the readers want it, that's a problem for the market to fix. But I mean, it's not deception. I think the main problem with AI, as I see it, which bothers many of us, is a deception, because we think it is X, but it is actually Y. And I think anything that helps us move from that is a step in the right direction. It's not the only thing, there's a lot more to be done, but at least it's a step in the right direction.
Seher, did you want to chime in on that one before we go to the next question, or do you feel like we've wrapped it?
Me?
You.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like nutritional labeling.
Yep.
In a way, and we have this. It's not about AI labeling, but Mozilla started this thing called Privacy Not Included, which is essentially, it's kind of like nutritional labeling for products to understand the level of privacy that's included, and it's really helpful. It's just a matter of literacy. Summer was talking about education, and the whole I don't know what the word is, like the premise of how information is produced in a way is completely changed with generative AI. So even the concept of when AI spits something out, it's looking at a large body of data and then spitting out a statistical average in most cases. So even that concept, to have the literacy of that concept is so different from the way that we look at a news article and consider what are the sources that led to this news. It's just like a completely different shift in how we can become literate in these things. I think education is going to be a really, really big part of it, and not just for young people, for all of us, because it's complex and it's just completely different from how our brains are used to processing information and being critical of information.
And the systems themselves. I mean, if you ask a question of ChatGPT, it types your answer back to look like it's thinking and providing an answer. And that's just one little trick that is used by the designers of the tool to make you feel like you are engaged with an intelligence and having a conversation. And it masks precisely the dynamic that you're talking about, which is, that this is a machine that's taking an average of a whole bunch of data and trying to put things together in a way that it thinks makes sense based on those calculations.
Yeah, not just a machine, it's a product.
Indeed, a product. Ange, do we have another question?
Yeah, the next question, somebody asked, disinformation and misinformation can have the same pernicious consequences. Does this mean we should treat them as the same and use the same tools to counter them?
Yeah, so I've thought a bit about it. I think it's a difference between murder and manslaughter, isn't it, under English common law? And by my reckoning, disinformation is murder and misinformation is manslaughter. To put it very, very crudely, this is not the best way to describe it at all. And I'm not a lawyer, but I mean, it's something, it helps me understand it, because disinformation is with intent to deceive. Misinformation can be entirely mistaken. So there are mitigating circumstances. And therefore, what we choose to do with countering that should factor that into account. Now, who should do it? What kind of mechanism we have to counter it are separate questions altogether. But I do distinguish between disinformation and misinformation.
But I think it's right that the impact is not necessarily different, right? I mean, and because misinformation, as you were saying earlier, Salil,
and
can
kill someone.
right.
Kill somebody. Yeah. So I mean, the effect is the same. I mean, I'm not undermining it at all. All I'm saying is that it's a question of intent to deceive.
Right. I think part of the problem too, I mean, part of what makes the challenge of mis and disinformation more pernicious on things like social media is that things are removed from their initial context too, right? So something that might not have been intended to be, had no negative intent behind it to begin with, maybe it, was attached to a satirical Facebook page or website to begin with, but now it just circulates on the internet on its own, detached from its original context. And now it essentially kind of functions as, deceptive content. That doesn't mean you want to regulate, satirical websites. And so it makes part of the challenge, and then I think, there is a separate issue to be dealt with when we're thinking about, something like Russia's campaign to insert disinformation into US elections or elections in other countries. I think that doesn't necessarily mean that the way you deal with the content is different, but the problem, the sort of root problem can be different. And the way that generative AI might amplify those problems is also different.
Yeah.
There are really interesting questions about, the reality. I mean, you compared these to sort of new concepts to very traditional crimes in the criminal justice system. And there's a fascinating conversation to be had about the ways that these tools and what they're used for actually do fit into existing law, and a corresponding conversation to be had about how do we identify the gaps where what we have now doesn't work. But that's, again, a different topic. Do we have another question, Ange?
Yeah, the next question is from Andrew. Andrew says, you've talked about holding platforms accountable for the consequences of the misuse of their services. Presumably, this applies to the generative AI platforms, such as ChatGPT. Do you think that OpenAI is acting responsibly? And if not, how can it be held accountable?
Any of our panelists like to start the conversation on that one?
I mean, I would only say it's too soon to tell because, it's ChatGPT has been with us for less than a year or something like that. Harmful effects, we don't yet know. At least I don't know. Let me put it that way. Unlike, when we, for example, we do know that the way Meta's products were misused in Sri Lankan conflict or Myanmar's conflict, or, how Meta was aware of what might happen when the Eritrean and Ethiopian conflict was going on. At least there was an awareness, and we know the direct contour. Oh, I think it would be very, very interesting to respond to this question honestly sometime in December next year, because we would have had one large election in India and one important election in the United States by then. And I know that in a way it would be arguing, oh, by then the damage is done. Probably. But I think that's when we would have enough. At least I feel I will know enough about what kind of because everyone has been crying wolf, saying that AI is going to affect the elections, and so unless the regulators, unless the civil society is not well prepared for it, then we are doomed. So I think the only way to deal with it is see how best we combat it. But I don't know how can we create a system of disincentives or punishments for things that haven't happened and what might happen, which we cannot anticipate. That's where I am.
Samar or Seher, do you have anything to add to that question of whether or not OpenAI is acting responsibly, and if they are not, how they should be held to account as a maker of, perhaps the most prominent generative AI product at this time in the market?
I don't personally have a strong opinion yet. I think it's a bit too early to tell, but I will say that so I'm connected to a lot of the open source community, and a lot of them are not happy with OpenAI because they haven't open sourced the code. And so they kind of question the motivations, especially given it's such a groundbreaking technology that could have such great benefits. So yeah, I'll say that, but I think for me personally, it's a bit too early to to say.
I think the only other thing I would say is I do think there's some real questions about sort of the ethics of how they built the data sets to train these tools, right? And if that was really about scraping every bit of information they could get their hands on the internet, including the content of copyrighted books and news sites, without thinking about sort of the compensation questions and the copyright questions, I have some real questions myself about sort of how that was done, and I think we'll be learning more about that too. I mean, this is where I think the question about transparency, what have these tools been trained on, how, what are the algorithms behind them, and better understanding all of that, I think is just going to be really essential, because I think, again, we'll kind of end up in the same place with social media companies where we don't fully understand, we don't fully know what we don't know. We just know there's a lot in there that we probably should know. And so I think again, over the next year or so, we'll probably have a better sense of how this is going to play out.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the question isn't so much have they been responsible, but is it possible to create this kind of system in a way that is responsible when you think about the data and the way these systems are trained? So in Canada, we have privacy law that says, when you put it online for one purpose on a site where you are supposedly protected by the terms of service, that you retain some reasonable expectations of privacy in that information. There's a big conversation that we haven't had yet in Canada and globally about what it means for information to be publicly available and what the rules should be around publicly available information. So in these systems that assume that if it's online, it's up for grabs, whether it's OpenAI and ChatGPT, or whether it's Clearview AI, putting anybody who's ever put their face online into a perpetual police lineup and selling it. Those conversations about how do we, can it be reasonable to leverage publicly available information that people did not intend to be used for these purposes to create products? Is the public benefit worth the risk or the transgression? Is there a way that these systems can be created in ways that are fair to, I don't like the phrase, but data rights holders, humans who live their lives online and would like some aspects of those lives to be protected and not just serve as the fodder for commercial endeavors. So I think it's a really fundamental and foundational question.
Yeah, and I think, again, when the incentive is profit, how do we change that incentive structure? How do we think about the incentive structure for these companies, such that we don't kind of end up in the same situation we're in with social media too?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard lots of claims about the ways in which these companies are in some ways democratizing AI by making it publicly available and open for use. But that's a very interesting concept of democracy when it's, when these tools are created by for-profit companies with a strong profit motive and fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders to produce that profit. So in a capitalist system, it's not even that they are not acting lawfully. They are acting as a capitalist organization is meant to ask in our regulatory structure. All right, off the soapbox. Do we have another question, Ange?
Yeah, the next question is from Karen. Karen asks, what are the implications of students using AI to write academic papers? How can colleges and universities monitor this, and should they monitor this?
I have thoughts on this as someone who's sort of a newly minted educator, but does anyone on the panel want to take a first stab first? First stab first, yes, so coherent.
I think it just illustrates the challenge. Right? So go ahead, Salil.
No, I was just going to say the students are already using it. I don't think it's a question of should the horse has bolted, as it were. So the question is that it's a challenge for the educator, I think, and I'm not an academic. I do teach occasionally, and I run a course in Norway and so on. But I do think that one of the things that creative academics have started doing is actually asking students to look at two pieces of work. One is original and one is AI, and to use their creative faculties to decide which is real and which is not. The other could be to check the verification and claim, because if it's AI generated, as we have just discussed, AI tends to claim something to be true, but AI is like a smart adolescent who's 17 years old and gives you a quick answer. But when you try to look at the claim, it may not be backed up because there is not enough life experience behind it. And I think if we were to check, it's like, when you see something on Wikipedia and a source, when you click on the source and if it says 404 file not found, you should be suspicious whether there is the information is accurate or not. And I think academics will just have to sleuth more. And just as now, all of you academics use plagiarism detector software tools, sooner or later we'll have AI detecting software tools available. I'm quite sure of that.
They're already available. It's deeply questionable how accurate or useful that they are.
Fair enough. Fair
But,
enough. Yeah.
The market has
reflect
already
biases
responded
too.
to that challenge. I think that there are some, ethical concerns with using those technologies, just as there are ethical concerns with using plagiarism to detect them, in terms of what we're teaching our students about trust and good behavior. I know at the university that I'm currently at, McMaster University, I spent part of the summer on a panel where the university was very seriously grappling with questions of how do we deal with artificial intelligence in the education system. We know students are using it. We know that most of the time they're better at using it than professors are at detecting it. We know that the tools to detect it aren't where they need to be used safely in a university, not least because there are privacy concerns with the way that the student information could be used in those tools. So the creative response from educators is really what Salil is saying. How do we teach students what this is and what the challenges are and what the risks are and what the potential benefits are? And, are there ways that students can be taught to use this properly? And if they're taught to use it properly, can we avoid them using it to cheat? So it's a really complicated question. It's one we're grappling with, but we are, at least in the public policy program that I run, trying to figure out what is the educational opportunity with this technology? How can we show students, look, this is a paper that, just as you said, this is a paper that AI wrote. This is a paper that a human wrote. Where are the differences? What were the strengths of the AI? What were the strengths of the person? Is there a way that we can think of to use the tool and reference it properly in that use to build on those strengths, but not diminish the human contribution? So it's a massive educational question, and it's one that every university and every high school and probably every middle school, at least in the country, is grappling with at this moment. So
there's another solution, but it's hugely labor intensive and extremely costly because it simply can't be done, but which is to do away with written exams and have only oral exams in future.
Yeah, or change methods of evaluation.
Absolutely.
Do we have another question?
Yeah, the next question is from Andrew, another one. Should we wait until the damage is done, or do we need to apply a precautionary principle when the impacts are presented as so major?
Apply a precautionary principle.
But be cautious about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, precautionary principle is great so long as it does not lead to stifling creativity and does not lead to stifling expression, because this can have devastating impact for cartoonists and satirists, for example,
Right.
who can use AI brilliantly to make fun of politicians, for example.
I mean, I think that, whatever happens, I think if a sort of human rights based approach is taken to these issues, then we'll be in better shape, right? And so I think, part of what we wanted to say with our paper, and I know others have too, is, that just has to be at the center of this conversation, both in terms of thinking about what the threats to human rights are from generative AI, but also in terms of centering that when we think about how we're responding and making sure that we're not creating new restrictions or infringing on rights in ways that are, really going to be problematic. So I think that just has to be at the center of kind of however we approach this going forward.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who works in privacy and surveillance, and I know that Andrew does also, I think there are interesting potential benefits to the precautionary principle in those areas that become a little bit less enticing and a little bit more problematic when we're talking about expression. Because we know that, state precautions around expression for the public good can swing very radically depending on the nature of the government and what their ideological position is on what is good for the public. And we don't escape those concerns in Canada. We like to pretend that we are the land of, good government. But we currently have 2 provincial governments who are passing laws, possibly with the use of our notwithstanding clause, which allows them to pass unconstitutional laws in order to deprive trans children in schools of the ability to confide in their teacher without their parents being notified. That is very firmly being positioned as a public good, and there are a vocal minority of people who believe that to be the case. So that's, I think, is just one really telling example of how a precautionary principle about kinds of speech could run into a really difficult problem about what kind of speech the government of the day believes is in the public interest. I think we have time for one final question.
Yeah, somebody asked, is there a technology that can detect authenticity of a video that is produced by AI?
Yes, but again, as you said, in terms of the tools for text as well, the reliability is questionable, and the detection technology is always going to be behind the technology, right? So I think that's kind of just a fundamental challenge there. But yes, I mean, there are tools out there. We also are doing work with journalists in terms of thinking about how they kind of, are better equipped to detect and address disinformation. And, there are tools that we recommend journalists make use of. Can't think of them all off the top of my head, but I could come up with them. And so, yes, that I think there are some tools out there that can be useful. I think people just have to be clear-eyed about sort of their reliability and again, that those come with their own sort of biases and flaws built in too.
Thank you to the audience for those wonderful questions. I think we'll close with a lightning round to our panel. If you could get the ears of policymakers in Canada and give them one piece of advice on what they should be doing to mitigate the risks of generative AI when it comes to freedom of expression, what would you tell them? Salil, go first.
Oh gosh, okay. What would I say? I think, err on the side of freedom. And err on the side of protecting minorities. I know in a way it might look as though you are minorities as in the vulnerable, those who do not have power. And be very, I mean, Canada is not the place that is about to break into a civil war, for example, but be very, very careful about the impact of a Canadian company which operates overseas and the kind of values it presents, and to make sure that they do not end up doing anything that might incite immediate violence. All the other things one can live with. I don't like restrictions on freedom at all, but I think the one distinction is if someone is going to call for a genocide, that is a problem. And I think that's where, and in a position to do something about it, that's even, I'm thinking of the Radio Rwanda type syndrome, yeah.
Seher?
I mean, I think I would also say to err on the side of protecting freedom of expression, but also to talk to the people who will be most affected by these technologies and by any potential regulation and restrictions, to talk to human rights advocates and experts, to talk to free expression advocates and experts, and make sure that those voices are part of the conversation.
And Seher, what would you advise our Canadian government?
I would say to upskill the civil service so that they have the tools and the knowledge to really meet some of these technologists head on at an equal level, because right now I think that's not the case. And we see that every time there's a hearing, especially in the US, it's really demonstrated the huge difference in knowledge, technical knowledge, and that really impacts the way that we can hold some of these companies to account.
I think all those things hold for policymakers everywhere, basically, on these issues.
It's almost a plug for the program I run, teaching policymakers to understand digital, which is, I think, a beautiful from my perspective to end on. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to our panel who took time today, especially Salil, doing it all the way from Copenhagen, very late at night, to share their experience.
I think to midnight, so yes.
Thank you to our audience who took time out of your day to attend and for your wonderful questions. Jim, would you like to rejoin us to close us out?
Yes, thank you. And I want to thank Seher, Summer, Salil, and you, Brenda, for a really engaging conversation. I think it was quite stimulating. And I want to thank the audience for attending today. And if any in the audience would like to share this conversation with friends or others who might be interested, a video of it is going to be posted on the CFE website tomorrow, as well as on the CFE YouTube channel. The CFE website is cfe.torontomu.ca. And videos of our past events are there as well. The next event is going to be a week from tomorrow on Wednesday, October 11th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. It's a very different subject. We're going to be looking at the public's right to know about toxic chemicals in Canada. It's titled Toxic Chemicals and Your Health, Regulations Protecting Canadians. And it's featuring Bruce Lemfier, who's one of the leading authorities on environmental health in Canada and is a professor of health sciences at Simon Fraser University. So information about our other upcoming events, our blogs, our commentaries, our resource materials are all available on our website. And tomorrow when we post the video, we're also going to post resources on today's subject that those of you who are interested in reading more about it might find useful. The panelists have suggested things that they'd encourage you to have a look at. So thank you all very much for attending, and we appreciate your interest. Bye-bye.